Remember that scene in 300 where Gerard Butler screams, "This is Sparta," while kicking someone into a pit? Yeah, that never happened. In fact, almost everything you think you know about Spartans is complete nonsense. Hollywood sold you a fantasy. School textbooks fed you propaganda. And for decades, we've been swallowing myths about ancient Greece's most overrated civilization. The Spartans weren't superhuman warriors who never retreated. They weren't noble defenders of freedom. Hell, they weren't even particularly good at being Spartans most of the time. Here's what really happened when you strip away the Hollywood makeup and dig into actual historical records. Spoiler alert. It's way more embarrassing than you'd expect. Let's start with the biggest lie. Spartans never surrender. This myth comes straight from Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans supposedly fought to the last man. Every movie, every book, every damn history lesson hammers this home. Spartans would rather die than surrender. It's their defining characteristic, right? Wrong. In 425 BC, during the Battle of Sphacteria, over 120 Spartan hoplites did something that supposedly never happened in their entire culture. They threw down their weapons and surrendered to the Athenians. Not 12, not 20, 120 elite Spartan warriors. These weren't green recruits or foreign mercenaries. These were full citizens, the cream of Spartan society, raised from birth in the legendary Agoge system. And they gave up. The surrender was so shocking that it sent ripples across the entire Greek world. According to Thucydides, most of the Spartans lowered their shields and made it clear that they wanted to surrender when they first heard the heralds. The Athenians were so stunned they paraded the captured Spartans around like exotic animals. But here's the kicker. When Sparta tried to negotiate their release, they offered to end the entire Peloponnesian War. Think about that. These never-surrender warriors were so valuable that Sparta was willing to throw away years of military gains just to get them back. When the Spartan commander Styphon asked for advice from the mainland, Sparta's response was telling, "Make your own decision about yourselves, so long as you do nothing dishonorable." In other words, we can't tell you to surrender, but we're not telling you to die either. The Athenians, being smart, said no. They kept those Spartans as bargaining chips for years, so much for death before dishonor. When push came to shove, survival instinct beat Spartan propaganda every single time. You don't learn this in history classes out there. Now let's talk about the most famous last stand in history, Thermopylae. You know the story. King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans fight to the death against impossible odds, epic sacrifice, ultimate heroism, the foundation of the entire Spartans never retreat mythology. Except there's a tiny detail Hollywood conveniently forgot to mention. Some Spartans survived Thermopylae, and when they came home, their own people treated them like absolute garbage. Meet Aristodemos. He was one of the 300. But he got sent away before the final battle with an eye infection. When he returned to Sparta, his fellow citizens nicknamed him the Trembler and completely shunned him. Nobody would talk to him, do business with him, or even give him fire to light his hearth. Think about that. This guy was selected for the 300, the absolute elite of Spartan society. He'd trained his entire life for war. He was probably a complete badass by any reasonable standard. But because he didn't die when he was supposed to, his own city branded him a coward. There was another survivor, Pantides, who had been sent as a messenger to Thessaly during the battle. When he came back and found out what happened, the shame was so overwhelming that he hanged himself. These weren't isolated incidents. The expectation to die was so extreme that surviving a defeat, even for completely legitimate reasons, was social suicide in Sparta. Aristodemos eventually redeemed himself by fighting with reckless abandon at the Battle of Plataea, where he finally got the death he owed society. But here's what's really telling. If Spartan culture was actually built around practical military excellence, wouldn't you want experienced veterans like Aristodemos alive and training the next generation? Instead, they created a system where survival itself was shameful. The Thermopylae myth works because we only hear about the ones who died, the ones who lived. They got erased from the story because they complicated the narrative. Here's another myth that needs to die. Sparta was an egalitarian paradise where all citizens were equal. This fairy tale comes from ancient writers like Plutarch, who romanticized Sparta's legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. According to the propaganda, Lycurgus divided land equally among all citizens, banned luxury, and created a society where everyone lived in identical simplicity. Sounds great, right? Except it's complete bullshit. First, let's talk about who actually counted as a citizen in this supposed equality paradise. Out of Sparta's total population of around 250,000 people, only about 8,000 were full Spartan citizens, the Spartiates. That's roughly 3% of the population. The other 97%, they were helots, state-owned slaves who did all the actual work. These weren't prisoners of war or foreign captives. Most were Greeks from neighboring regions that Sparta had conquered, particularly the Messenians. They were literally enslaved in their own homeland and forced to work Spartan farms. But even among the elite 3%, equality was a joke. Over time, land and wealth became massively concentrated among a few powerful families. By the 4th century BC, Aristotle noted that Sparta had serious inequality problems, with some citizens owning huge estates while others had almost nothing. The famous Spartan equality meals, the syssitia, weren't actually equal at all. Citizens had to contribute food to these communal dinners, but richer Spartans could obviously contribute more and better food. If you couldn't afford your contribution, you lost citizenship entirely. So much for equality, and here's the kicker. While regular Spartans supposedly lived in austere simplicity, the kings and elite families were living it up. Archaeological evidence shows luxury goods, fancy jewelry, and elaborate houses in Sparta. The austerity was just for show. The Helots, meanwhile, lived in constant terror. Sparta had an official policy called the Crypteia, essentially a secret police made up of young Spartan men who would hunt and kill Helots to keep them terrified and compliant. Every year, Sparta formally declared war on the Helots just so they could murder them without religious consequence. This wasn't equality. This was an apartheid state with a tiny ruling class living off the backs of enslaved masses while pretending to be morally superior to everyone else. Want to know when the invincible Spartan military machine got absolutely humiliated? July 6, 371 BC, the Battle of Leuctra. The day a small Greek city called Thebes proved that Spartan supremacy was just clever marketing. For decades, Sparta had dominated Greek warfare through sheer reputation. Other cities would often surrender or retreat just at the sight of Spartan armies. The psychological advantage was enormous, until one brilliant general called Epaminondas decided to call their bluff. Epaminondas did something revolutionary. He actually studied how Spartans fought instead of just being intimidated by them. He noticed that Spartan battle formation was predictable. They always put their best troops on the right wing, following traditional Greek military doctrine. So Epaminondas did the opposite. He loaded his left wing with his elite sacred band, 150 pairs of male lovers who fought with insane dedication because they literally couldn't bear to look cowardly in front of their partners. Then he made his left wing incredibly deep, 50 men instead of the usual 8 to 12. When the battle started, this concentrated force smashed through the Spartan right wing like a sledgehammer through glass. The Spartan king Cleombrotus was killed in the fighting, along with about 400 full Spartan citizens. Now, 400 dead might not sound like much, but remember, Sparta only had about 1,500 full citizens left by this point. They'd been slowly bleeding numbers for decades due to their ridiculously exclusive citizenship requirements and constant warfare. Losing 400 in a single battle was catastrophic. The psychological impact was even worse than the casualties. For the first time in living memory, a Spartan army had been decisively beaten in a fair fight. The aura of invincibility was shattered forever, but Epaminondas wasn't done humiliating them. He refused to allow the Spartans to retrieve their dead from the battlefield, a devastating blow to Greek honor culture. Then he marched his army directly through Spartan territory with impunity, demonstrating to the entire Greek world that Sparta could no longer protect even its own homeland. After Leuctra, Thebes liberated the Helots in Messenia, the slave population that had sustained Spartan society for centuries. Without their enslaved workforce, Sparta's economy collapsed. Within a generation, Sparta went from being the dominant power in Greece to a minor regional player. They never recovered their position. All it took was one competent general who refused to be impressed by their reputation. Let's talk about the agoge, Sparta's famous education system that supposedly produced the world's greatest warriors. Modern people love to romanticize it as some kind of elite military academy that built character and discipline. Reality check: it was a brutal indoctrination program designed to create obedient killers, not strategic thinkers. Starting at age 7, Spartan boys were ripped away from their families and thrown into group barracks. They were deliberately underfed to encourage them to steal food, but if they got caught stealing, they were beaten savagely. The lesson wasn't don't steal, it was don't get caught. The kids were given minimal clothing and forced to sleep on beds they made themselves from reeds. They weren't allowed shoes. In winter, they were encouraged to fight each other constantly, and the adults would pit different groups against each other in vicious competitions. But here's what the agoge didn't teach: independent thinking, strategic planning, or adapting to new situations. The entire system was built around following orders without question and enduring physical hardship. That's it. Compare this to Athens, where elite young men studied mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and military strategy. Athenian generals like Themistocles and Pericles could think on their feet, adapt to changing circumstances, and come up with innovative solutions. Spartan generals? They were basically very disciplined muscle. When they encountered something outside their training, they often fell apart. That's exactly what happened at Leuctra. When faced with an innovative tactic they'd never seen before, they had no idea how to respond. The Argoge produced soldiers who were great at maintaining formation and following orders, but terrible at independent command. That's why Sparta rarely produced military innovators or tactical geniuses. Their system actively discouraged the kind of creative thinking that wins wars. Even worse, the Argoge created adults who were basically sociopaths. These guys spent their formative years learning that violence was the solution to everything and that anyone weaker than them deserved abuse. Then they graduated to become the ruling class of a society built on enslaving their neighbors. The end result wasn't noble warriors. It was institutionally traumatized bullies with weapons. Here's a myth that even modern feminists sometimes buy into. Spartan women were liberated and empowered compared to other Greek women. On the surface, it looks convincing. Spartan women could own property, participate in athletics, and move around publicly without male guardians. Compare that to Athens, where upper-class women were basically locked in their houses and treated like expensive furniture. But dig deeper, and you'll realize Spartan women weren't free. They were just a different kind of state property. The reason Spartan women could own land? Because their husbands were constantly away at war or living in military barracks, and somebody had to manage the estates and heel out slaves. It wasn't liberation, it was economic necessity. The reason they did athletics and physical training, not for personal fulfillment, but because Sparta needed them to produce healthy warrior babies. The state literally monitored their fertility and physical condition like prize-breeding animals. Spartan women were expected to be just as ruthless and militaristic as the men. Plutarch recorded stories of Spartan mothers telling their sons to come back with your shield or on it, meaning return victorious or dead. But these stories, like most Spartan propaganda, were probably exaggerated or invented entirely to fit the narrative. Real or not, the expectation was clear. These women were supposedly programmed to value military honor over their children's lives. But think about what that actually means. These women were so thoroughly indoctrinated by state propaganda that they'd rather have dead children than living cowards. The marriage system was equally messed up. Young Spartan men would literally kidnap their brides and consummate the marriage in secret. The wife would continue living with her family and only meet her husband for clandestine encounters until he was older and had proven himself militarily. This wasn't romantic. It was designed to minimize emotional attachment between spouses so that military duty would always come first. Sparta systematically destroyed family bonds to create loyalty to the state. The supposed freedom of Spartan women was really just a different flavor of oppression. Instead of being controlled by individual men, they were controlled by the state's military needs. Their value was measured entirely by their ability to produce and raise future soldiers. That's not liberation. That's just being a cog in a different kind of machine. Our final myth: Spartans were austere and rejected luxury and wealth. This comes from stories about Lycurgus banning gold and silver coins, forcing Spartans to use heavy iron bars as currency. The idea was that this made wealth accumulation impossible and kept everyone focused on virtue instead of material gain, pure theater. Archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Excavations in Sparta have uncovered expensive jewelry, elaborate bronze work, fine pottery, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. These weren't foreign imports that somehow snuck in. They were owned and used by wealthy Spartans. The reality is that rich Spartans simply got better at hiding their wealth. They couldn't flaunt it openly because of social pressure, so they became masters of discreet luxury. Think of it like modern billionaires who dress down in public but own private jets. Even more telling, Sparta had a policy called xenolasia, the systematic expulsion of foreigners. The official reason was to prevent foreign corruption of Spartan values. But the real reason was probably to keep outsiders from seeing how hypocritical their society actually was. Can't have foreign visitors noticing that your supposedly austere warriors are wearing golden jewelry and eating off expensive silverware. The iron currency thing was mostly symbolic anyway. For major transactions, Spartans used regular Greek silver coins just like everyone else. The iron bars were for small daily purchases, basically ancient virtue signaling. By the 4th century BC, Spartan inequality was so obvious that even other Greeks commented on it. Some Spartan families controlled massive estates while others had almost nothing. The legendary Spartan king Agus IV actually tried to redistribute land and